By the autumn of 1914, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had stopped moving entirely. For a few short weeks, it had been a war of marching armies, of cavalry and open fields, exactly the kind of war the generals had trained for their entire lives. And then, almost overnight, it froze. From the coast of the North Sea all the way to the border of Switzerland, the armies of Europe dug themselves into the earth. They scraped and clawed a pair of enormous scars across the face of the continent. 2 lines of trenches facing each other across a strip of shattered ground for more than 400 miles. And between those trenches lay a place that would become one of the most terrible words of the 20th century. No man's land. Think about what it meant to stand in a trench and look out across that ground. Somewhere out there, a few hundred yards away, was the enemy, and between you and him lay a wilderness of mud, of splintered trees and flooded craters, wrapped in thick belts of barbed wire and swept, every single yard of it, by machine guns. To climb out of your trench and walk across that ground was very often to die, not in a heroic charge, not sword against sword, but cut down in seconds by a weapon that never grew tired, never flinched, and never stopped. For 4 years, the great powers of the world hurled millions of young men against that ground, and again, the ground won. A single defended line could swallow the lives of an entire generation and give almost nothing back. Armies would fight for months, bleed themselves white, and move the front by a few miles of poisoned mud. The war had become a siege with no walls and no end. And in the middle of that horror, in the workshops and drawing rooms of a desperate nation, a small group of men began to dream of a machine that could do what no soldier could, a machine that could cross no man's land, a machine that could crush the wire, ignore the bullets, and carry the fight straight into the enemy's trenches. They were dreaming of a monster made of steel. This is the history of the tank, the steel monster born in the mud of the Somme. To understand why the tank was invented, you first have to understand exactly why the war had frozen, because the tank was not born as a clever idea in peacetime. It was born out of pure, screaming necessity. It was an answer to a problem that was killing men by the hundreds of thousands. That problem was the defensive power of modern industrial weapons. By 1914, 3 things had come together to make the attack almost impossible. The first was the machine gun. A single one of these weapons, crewed by a handful of men, could fire hundreds of rounds a minute and sweep an entire field with a scythe of lead. Advancing infantry out in the open had almost no defense against it. Men who had been trained to charge found themselves walking into a wall of bullets. The second was barbed wire, cheap, simple, and utterly vicious. It was strung in great tangled belts in front of every trench, sometimes dozens of yards deep. Attacking soldiers, already under fire, would reach the wire and become trapped in it, hung up like insects in a web, while the machine guns did their work. And the third was artillery. Massed batteries of modern guns could drop a storm of high-explosive shells onto any attack, tearing men apart before they had crossed even half of no man's land, and churning the whole battlefield into an ocean of mud that swallowed boots, horses, and wagons alike. Wire to trap you, artillery to blast you, and machine guns to cut you down. Together, these weapons handed an overwhelming advantage to whoever was defending, and so the men in charge faced a nightmare with no obvious solution. To attack was to die. To do nothing was to lose. They tried everything. They fired bombardments that lasted for days, hurling millions of shells, trying to smash the defences flat before the men went over the top. And still, when the guns fell silent and the infantry climbed out of their trenches, the enemy machine guns were waiting. Nowhere was this horror clearer than on a river in northern France, whose name would come to stand for the whole tragedy of the war: the Somme. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in July of 1916, the British Army suffered around 60,000 casualties, 60,000 men killed or wounded in a single day. Many of them were cut down in the first minutes, walking slowly across no man's land toward machine guns that the great bombardment had failed to destroy. It remains one of the bloodiest days in the entire history of the British Army. Something had to change. There had to be a way to cross that ground, and the answer, when it came, would combine two very old dreams with two very new machines. The dream itself was ancient. For thousands of years, human beings had imagined a way to bring protection and firepower together into a single moving machine. The war elephants of the ancient world were, in a sense, living tanks, great armoured beasts that could crash through enemy lines. In the Middle Ages, the Hussite warriors of Bohemia chained together war wagons fitted with armour and early guns to make rolling fortresses on the battlefield. And in the Renaissance, the great genius Leonardo da Vinci sketched a design for a covered circular fighting vehicle bristling with cannon that could roll into battle and fire in every direction. It was on paper a kind of tank, dreamed up more than 4 centuries before the real thing appeared. But for all these dreams, the machine could not be built, because 2 crucial pieces were missing, and they would not arrive until the modern age. The first missing piece was an engine. For all of history, war machines had been dragged by muscle, by men, by horses, by oxen. To build a fighting machine that could move under its own power, heavy with armor and weapons, you needed a compact, powerful source of motion. That arrived in the late 19th century with the internal combustion engine, the same invention that gave the world the automobile. Suddenly a machine could carry its own power with it, in the form of an engine burning fuel. The second missing piece was even more important, and it came from the fields, not the battlefield. It was the continuous track, the loop of linked metal plates that we now recognize instantly as the mark of a tank. Think about the problem. Wheels are wonderful on a hard, smooth road, but out on soft ground, in mud, in the shell-torn wilderness of no man's land, a heavy-wheeled vehicle simply sinks. Its narrow wheels press down with enormous force on a tiny patch of earth, and it bogs down helplessly. The continuous track solved this beautifully. Instead of rolling on a small point, the vehicle laid down its own flat road ahead of itself, spreading its great weight across a long, wide band of ground. A tracked machine could crawl over soft earth, climb over obstacles, and cross broken ground that would trap any wheeled vehicle instantly. This idea had been developed before the war for peaceful purposes, for the crawling tractors that hauled heavy loads and worked the fields of farms in America and Britain. Engineers had built machines that could drag plows and guns across ground that horses could barely manage. And a handful of far-sighted people looked at these crawling agricultural tractors and saw something else entirely. They saw a machine that could crawl across a battlefield. So the pieces were finally in place. The engine to give it power, the track to give it footing, armor to protect its crew, and guns to give it teeth. All that remained was for someone to put them together and to fight the long, frustrating battle to convince the world that such a machine was worth building at all. That battle was fought by a small handful of determined men, and it was nearly as hard as the war itself. One of the earliest and most important voices belonged to a British officer named Ernest Swinton. Early in the war, Swinton saw the deadlock forming with his own eyes, and he remembered those crawling tractors from before the war. He began to argue, forcefully, that Britain should build armoured tracked machines that could cross the trenches, crush the wire, and destroy the machine guns that were slaughtering the infantry. He was not the only one thinking along these lines, but he became one of the most persistent. The trouble was that many senior commanders were deeply skeptical. The idea sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. A land battleship, an armoured monster crawling across the fields. Some dismissed it outright. But the idea found a powerful champion in an unexpected place, the Navy. At the head of the British Navy at the time was a young, ambitious, and famously energetic politician named Winston Churchill. When Churchill heard the arguments for these armoured machines, he threw his weight behind them. And because the early experiments involved something like a ship that travelled on land, the Navy took charge of the secret project. Churchill helped create a committee to develop these machines, and it was given a name that captured the strangeness of the whole idea. It was called the Landships Committee. Landships, ships for the land. That was how these men thought of the machine they were trying to build, a warship that could sail across solid ground. The engineers, designers, and industrialists brought into this secret project set to work on a problem no one had ever solved. They had to build a machine heavy enough to carry armor that would stop bullets, powerful enough to move that weight across broken ground, and shaped in a way that could climb out of a trench and crush its way through barbed wire. There were countless failures, countless dead ends. Early prototypes bogged down, broke apart, or simply could not cross a wide enough gap. But step by step, the design took shape. The first true prototype was a boxy, awkward machine, and it was affectionately nicknamed Little Willie. It could move on its tracks, but it struggled with the wide trenches of the Western Front. The engineers realized they needed a completely different shape, and so they arrived at the design that would change warfare forever. Instead of a low car-like box, they built a machine shaped like a great rhomboid, a huge elongated diamond with its tracks running not underneath the body, but all the way around the outside, over the top, and around the entire hull. This strange shape had a purpose. That high, curving front let the machine rear up, catch the far lip of a trench, and haul its whole enormous body across a gap that would have stopped anything else. This second design was nicknamed Big Willie, and also, more tenderly, Mother. And Mother was the true ancestor of every tank that has ever rolled into battle since. She weighed around 28 tons. She was crewed by 8 men. And her guns were mounted not in a turret on top, but in armoured boxes on her sides, called sponsons, borrowed from the design of warships. Now there was one more problem. A problem not of engineering, but of secrecy. Britain was building a revolutionary weapon, and it was vital that the enemy did not find out. As these strange machines were built and shipped, the workers and soldiers needed a cover story, an innocent-sounding word to describe the large steel boxes they were moving around. Someone suggested that they looked like they might be mobile water carriers, water tanks for use in the desert. And so to disguise them, the machines were officially referred to as tanks. The name was meant to be a lie, a piece of misdirection to fool enemy spies. But it stuck. The disguise became the name, and that is why to this very day we call these armoured monsters by the humble, ordinary word for a container of water: tank. By the late summer of 1916, a small number of these first tanks were ready, and the men in command, desperate for any way to break the murderous deadlock of the Somme, decided to send them into battle. On the 15th of September 1916, on the battlefield of the Somme, the tank went to war for the very first time in human history. Picture the scene from the German side of the line. For weeks and months, the war had followed its grim and familiar rhythm. And then, out of the smoke and the dawn mist, came something that no soldier had ever seen before. Vast, dark shapes, groaning and clanking, crawling steadily forward across the very ground that was supposed to be impassable. They crushed the barbed wire flat beneath them. They ignored the rifle and machine gun fire that sparked harmlessly off their steel hides, and they came on, slowly and relentlessly, straight toward the trenches. For some of the defending soldiers, the shock was overwhelming. Here was a machine that broke every rule of the war they thought they understood. Bullets did nothing. The wire did nothing. In places, defenders abandoned their positions and fled, or surrendered rather than face these crawling steel monsters. Where the tanks worked, they achieved in minutes what had cost thousands of lives elsewhere. But, and this is crucial, that first day was very far from a clean triumph. The early tanks were desperately unreliable. They were mechanical infants rushed into battle before they were truly ready. Of the few dozen sent forward, many broke down before they even reached the enemy. Others became stuck in the mud or ditched in shell craters. Their engines were brutally hot and filled the interior with choking fumes. The crews inside worked in a deafening, roasting, poisonous darkness, and simply steering the machine took several men working together. And so the first appearance of the tank was a strange mixture, a glimpse of a stunning new future delivered by machines that were still barely able to function. Some senior officers were unimpressed and thought the whole experiment had failed, but others saw past the breakdowns to the enormous promise underneath. They understood that they had just witnessed the birth of something that would transform war. The problem was not the idea. The problem was that the machine simply needed to grow up. Before we follow that machine off the fields of the Somme and into the battles that would make it legendary, let me take just one quick moment. If you are enjoying this journey so far, please take a second right now to subscribe to Arsenal of Empires. This channel is devoted entirely to the weapons and the technologies that built and destroyed the great empires of history, the tools that quietly and sometimes violently rewrote the fate of the world. If you are finding this story as gripping as we do, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and leave a comment telling us the moment that has struck you the most so far. Was it the horror of no man's land? The secret dream of the Landships Committee, or the first tanks crawling out of the mist on the Somme? Your likes and comments genuinely help a young, growing channel like this one reach more people who love history And if you are not already subscribed, now is the perfect moment. Now let us watch the steel monster learn how to fight. After that first, imperfect appearance on the Somme, the tank entered a period of furious learning. Every battle taught brutal lessons, and each new design tried to fix the failures of the last. The machines grew more reliable. New versions were built in greater numbers, with better armour and improved engines. The British produced marks of the heavy rhomboid tank in the thousands, and the design was refined again and again. And slowly, the commanders and crews began to understand something even more important than the machines themselves. They began to understand how to use them. The first great lesson was that tanks should not be scattered thinly across a battlefield, sent forward in ones and twos to be picked off or bogged down. They should be gathered together, be massed in great numbers, and launched in a single, overwhelming blow at a carefully chosen point. That lesson was proven spectacularly in November of 1917 at a place called Cambrai. At Cambrai, the British gathered hundreds of tanks and sent them forward together across firm ground, supported by infantry and a sudden surprise bombardment. The effect was astonishing. Instead of the usual crawling, bloody advance of a few hundred yards, the tanks smashed through the formidable German defences and tore open a gap several miles deep in a matter of hours. Back home, church bells were rung in celebration, something that had scarcely happened in the entire war. Cambrai did not win the war, and much of the ground gained was later lost. But it proved beyond any doubt what a mass of tanks could do. It showed the world a glimpse of a completely new kind of warfare, one where armoured machines, not walking infantry, led the assault. The genie was out of the bottle. By 1918, in the final year of the war, the tank had come of age, and now it was joined by new kinds of tanks that pointed the way to the future. Alongside the slow, heavy rhomboid machines came lighter, faster tanks designed to exploit a breakthrough, to race forward once the line was cracked and cause chaos in the enemy's rear. The British built a quicker machine nicknamed the Whippet, and across the lines the French were developing something even more revolutionary, a small, light tank called the Renault FT. The Renault FT deserves special attention because it, even more than Mother, is the true ancestor of the modern tank as we know it today. It introduced a layout so sensible that it has been used on almost every tank ever since. Its engine was at the back, its crew sat in the middle, and its main gun was mounted in a rotating turret on top, which could turn to aim in any direction, all the way around, without the whole machine having to move. If you picture a tank in your mind right now, you are almost certainly picturing the basic layout of the little Renault FT, a design more than a century old. The tank reached its wartime peak in the great Allied offensives of 1918. In August of that year, at the Battle of Amiens, hundreds of tanks led a massive combined assault that shattered the German front. It was such a catastrophe for the German army that one of their own commanders would later call the 8th of August the Black Day of the German army. The deadlock had truly been broken at last. In the final months of the war, the front began to move again, and the age of frozen trench warfare came to an end. When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, the tank had proven itself. In just 2 years, it had gone from a handful of unreliable prototypes crawling through the mud of the Somme to a war-winning weapon fielded in the thousands. But its story was only just beginning. The greatest chapters was still to come. In the years of peace that followed the First World War, a fierce argument raged in the armies of the world over what the tank truly meant. Many older commanders saw the tank as nothing more than a support weapon, a slow, useful tool for helping the infantry and nothing more, but a small group of brilliant and often unpopular thinkers saw something far greater. In Britain, officers and writers argued that tanks should be gathered into their own independent armoured formations, fast-moving fleets of tanks that could punch through an enemy line and then drive deep into his rear, spreading paralysis and collapse, ending a battle not through slaughter, but through speed and shock. For the most part, these thinkers were ignored or only half heard in their own countries, but their ideas were studied very carefully somewhere else. In Germany, a new generation of officers, among them a determined man named Guderian, seized upon these theories of fast, concentrated armoured warfare and built them into the heart of a new kind of army. They combined tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft into a single, coordinated, hard-hitting force designed to break through and race forward before the enemy could react. The world would come to know this new way of war by a single, chilling word: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. When the Second World War exploded across Europe in 1939 and 1940, the results stunned the world. German armoured formations, spearheaded by their Panzer tanks and working hand in hand with aircraft, tore through their opponents at breathtaking speed. Countries that had expected another long, grinding war like the last one instead found themselves overrun in a matter of weeks. The tank, used in mass and with daring, had become the decisive weapon of the age. The very machine that had been born to break the stalemate of the trenches had now made the stalemate itself a thing of the past. The Second World War became the greatest age of the tank the world has ever seen, and it drove the machine's development forward at a furious pace in a deadly race between armour and firepower. On the vast plains of the Eastern Front, where Germany and the Soviet Union fought the largest land war in human history, the tank reached its terrible peak. The Soviet Union produced one of the most famous and influential tanks of all time, the T-34. It was a masterpiece of practical design, combining a powerful gun, thick, sloped armour that helped deflect enemy shells, and wide tracks that let it move across snow and mud that bogged down other machines. Above all, it was built to be produced in staggering numbers, churned out by the tens of thousands. Germany answered with tanks that were, in many ways, technically superior. Heavier, more sophisticated machines like the fearsome Tiger, with its thick armour and its deadly, accurate gun. A single Tiger could destroy many enemy tanks before it was knocked out. But these machines were complex, expensive, and slow to build, and Germany could never produce enough of them. This was one of the great lessons of the war. It was not always the single most powerful tank that decided the outcome. It was the balance between quality, quantity, and reliability. A merely good tank that could be built in vast numbers, kept running, and replaced quickly when lost, often proved more valuable than a magnificent machine that was too rare and too troublesome to field in strength. The Western Allies understood this too. The American Sherman tank was not the toughest or most heavily gunned machine on the battlefield, but it was reliable, easy to produce, and available in enormous numbers, and it helped carry the Allied armies to victory. The clash of these steel monsters reached its climax in the summer of 1943 on the Eastern Front near a place called Kursk. There, the German and Soviet armies threw thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles against one another in what is often described as the greatest tank battle in history. Across the dust and smoke of those enormous plains, the machines that had been born in the mud of the Somme now numbered in the thousands, deciding the fate of nations in a titanic collision of armour. When the battle ended, the German ability to launch great offensives in the east was broken, and the tide of the war turned. By the end of the Second World War, the tank stood as one of the dominant weapons on the planet. But its evolution did not stop when the war ended. Instead, it entered a new age. During the long decades of the Cold War, when the armies of East and West faced each other across a divided Europe, the tank remained the king of the land battlefield. But the many different types of the war years, the light tanks, the medium tanks, the heavy tanks, gradually merged into a single dominant concept. It was called the main battle tank. The main battle tank was designed to do everything at once. It combined the firepower once reserved for the heaviest machines, the mobility of the mediums, and the best protection that could be carried, all in a single, balanced design. Nations poured vast resources into these machines, and they became the armoured fist of every major army. Famous designs emerged on both sides of the divide, machines whose names became well known around the world: the American Abrams, the German Leopard, the British Challenger, and the Soviet families of tanks fielded in enormous numbers. And once again, the ancient race between armour and firepower drove the machine forward. As anti-tank weapons grew more deadly, guns, missiles, and shaped charge warheads that could burn through solid steel, the tank had to find new ways to survive. Engineers developed brilliant new forms of protection. They created advanced composite armor, layering different materials together to defeat incoming rounds far more effectively than steel alone. They added explosive reactive armor, blocks fitted to the outside of the tank that detonate outward to disrupt an incoming warhead. And they built sophisticated systems to help the crew see, aim and fire with deadly accuracy by day or by night, even while moving at speed. The modern main battle tank became one of the most complex and powerful weapons ever placed in the hands of a small crew. A single one of these machines carries a gun that can destroy a target miles away, armor that can shrug off many threats, and an engine powerful enough to hurl its 60 or 70 tons of steel across country at the speed of a car. It is the direct descendant of Mother crawling across the Somme, but grown almost beyond recognition. And yet, in our own time, the tank faces hard questions about its future. Modern battlefields are filled with new dangers. Cheap, portable missiles can be carried by a single soldier and used to knock out a machine costing many millions. And in recent years, small, inexpensive drones, flying robots, carrying explosives, or feeding targeting information to distant guns have shown that they can hunt and destroy even the most advanced tanks from above. Some observers have looked at these new threats and declared that the age of the tank is finally over, just as some once declared the age of the wall was over, or the age of the battleship. But the tank has faced predictions of its own death many times before, and each time it has adapted and survived. It has changed its armor, changed its tactics, and changed the way it fights alongside infantry, aircraft, and now drones of its own. For more than a century, whenever armies have needed to combine protected firepower with the ability to seize and hold ground, they have returned again and again to the same fundamental idea that was born in the trenches of the First World War. A crew protected by armour, carrying a powerful gun, moving on tracks, going where no soldier on foot could survive. So let us step back and look at the whole astonishing arc of this story. It begins in a place of pure horror. The frozen, blood-soaked trenches of the First World War, where wire, artillery and the machine gun had made attack almost impossible, and where a single day on the Somme could cost 60,000 men. Out of that nightmare came a desperate dream built from two old ideas: the armoured fighting machine imagined since the days of Leonardo, and two new inventions: the engine and the continuous track. A small band of determined men working under the innocent cover name of tanks turned that dream into steel. On the 15th of September 1916, those first clumsy monsters crawled out of the mist on the Somme and changed war forever. From there, the machine grew up with terrifying speed. It learned to attack in mass at Cambrai. It helped shatter the deadlock and win the war at Amiens. The little Renault FT gave it the shape it still wears today. Between the wars, bold thinkers imagined fleets of tanks striking deep and fast, and in the lightning campaigns of the Second World War, that vision became a devastating reality. On the plains of the East, at Kursk, tanks clashed in their thousands, and through the long Cold War and into our own century, the tank evolved into the mighty main battle tank, the armoured king of the modern battlefield. For 4 terrible years, the mud and the machine gun ruled the war, and no army could move. And then out of that very mud, wrapped in smoke and crawling on steel tracks, a monster was born that would give movement back to war and dominate the land battlefield for 100 years and more. That is the history of the tank and the steel monster born in the mud of the Somme. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you. That truly means a great deal. And if you have not yet subscribed to Arsenal of Empires, please take a moment to subscribe right now, especially if you are not already a subscriber. It genuinely makes an enormous difference for a growing channel like this one, and it means you will not miss the next chapter in the history of the weapons that shaped our world. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like so more history lovers can discover it, and leave a comment telling us which weapon, which machine, or which empire you would like us to explore next. From the steel monster that was born in the mud and changed the face of war forever, thank you for watching. And we will see you in the next one here on Arsenal of Empires.